All right, good evening, everyone. This is our house hunting and hacking group, and we are unlocking the power of real estate together. We meet on the second and fourth Tuesdays of every once a month, or so twice a month. Second and fourth Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And we have our HHH admins, which is myself, Genevieve Henderson, as a loan advisor. And John Nichols is our realtor, and Amber Zamudio is our insurance specialist. And tonight,
Sergio is just my stage name, so I'm really
yeah,
John Nichols. Just
so when you see
decided to sign in with a different alias today.
John was identifying this evening as Sergio. So when you hear that name pop up, possibly in the chat or wherever, where it's actually represented by John Nichols, who's our presenter this evening. Amber Zamudio is going to be our moderator, moderating the chat box for us. And our topic is the impact of realtor commission changes on your home buying and selling.
And I think what we might do is kind of do a part one and a part two because there is so much more that is coming around. So Jose, I think we'll go ahead and do like a question and answer for some of these, and then as I continue to learn more, I will definitely share those with you either individually or in another podcast. Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
So I believe Genevieve is going to, we've generated some questions and thought instead of just doing a lecture, it would be more like a question and answer. And Jose, feel free to jump in with questions as well. I always try to be as interactive as I can. I've been a teacher for a long time. I'm phasing down as a part-time teacher in Longmont, full-time realtor. So I do believe that, the more active we all are, the better we retain things. So whatever questions you have, you can just piggyback at any time. Amber will be womaning, not manning. She'll be womaning the text box to see what's out there.
All
Sounds
right.
good.
So our first question is, how will the changes affect me as a buyer, or maybe Jose?
Yeah, I think what's happening right now is there's a lot of changes in the industry. And just to recap a few things, the way the system is now, when I speak to a seller, for instance, I will ask them the question, how much total real estate commission do you want to pay? And they may say 4%. And then from there, I will talk to them about, you can cut that to 3, you can cut that to 2. If you want to go 4%, as a listing agent, I don't plan on taking all 4%. One of the things we'll talk about is the pros and cons of taking some of that percentage and offering it on the multiple listing service so that buyers agents, as they're looking for homes, if they find things to send to buyers, they know that there is a commission offered to them if they bring a viable buyer to the closing table. The way everything is going to change is starting August 17th. It was going to be July 1st. It's now August 17th. That commission can no longer be advertised on the multiple listing service. Now, I can still have the conversation with the seller and say, what do you feel about the possibility of offering some sort of compensation to the buyer's agent? And the seller may say, yes. I mean, I've already had sellers now, and we've had that conversation about what's going to happen, in the old system versus when we transition to the new system. And in many cases, they're like, well, we want to have a qualified buyer's agent working with buyers. We want lots of buyers to come to the table, and we want lots of offers because ultimately the seller wants to sell the home. So that being said, a lot of sellers are still thinking that even after the change, they are going to weigh the pros and cons. And in many cases, they see more pros than cons of offering some sort of compensation. But the biggest change is that it will no longer be advertised. So the buyer's agent will need to sit down with the buyer and talk about the value that he or she offers to the buyer. Even to show a property, there has to be some sort of agreement between the buyer's agent and the buyer. Now, that does not have to be a full agreement. It can be more like dating versus marriage. There's a lot of talk right now, even though it's kind of a moving target. There's a lot of talk that the initial showings can be just a very rudimentary form just to say, we're not in a full scale relationship, but I am representing you temporarily as a buyer's agent. But there still has to be that talk with the buyer, even in that case, before the buyer maybe signs that second agreement that does create more of a commitment with the buyer's agent. No matter which one we're dealing with, the dating one or the marriage one, the agent and the buyer need to have a conversation about compensation. So the buyer's agent needs to do a better job of clarifying with the buyer, here are the things that I do, here's the expectation of pay, and whatever they agree to, that number cannot change. So Jose, if you and I are having a conversation and I say, here's the value of what I bring. If you decide to work with me, my compensation is 3%. So you sign that contract. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to pay that 3%. That means that we can still look at homes. And in many cases, as the buyer's agent, I will now be calling the listing agent or looking at the listing agent's website to find out for the properties that we're thinking of going to see, is the seller willing to offer compensation? And if the answer is yes or no, we can still see all the homes. But in the agreement that we have, I will be compensated one way or the other. I will either be compensated through the credit or the, what's the word I'm thinking of? The concessions that the seller is willing to offer to pay for my services, or if there is none available and you as the buyer say, I still want to buy that home, even though there's nothing available from the seller, then if you have the funds, then you would pay me because of the agreement that we made. Now, what I'm understanding is if we have an agreement at 3%, let's say we have an agreement at 2%, you agree whether we can find that money in the form of a concession from the seller or whether you pay out of pocket. You agree, okay, John, I love your services. I will give you 2%. Let's say that we find out that there's a home you like and the seller is actually willing to offer 3%. What cannot happen under the new rules is I can't change the original contract and get the 3%. So the podcast I listened to today, it seems like the prevailing wisdom would be that the buyer's agent and the buyer have a conversation of maybe a higher number to start off with. But then if we find the home and the concessions from the seller is lower than that, you are allowed to lower that rate and then everything's fine. So let's say that we're in a situation where the agreement says 3% and the buyer agrees to that, but then we find a home and they're only offering 2%. As the buyer's agent, if I'm okay with that, then I will get the 2%. And in this case, it would have been a concession by the seller. And even though the agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent was 3%, I can go down. But what I can't do is the opposite. That's what the lawsuit stipulates, because what they don't want is any thought or any potential that buyers would steer away and think, oh, well, the agreement says 2%, but I just went on the MLS and I saw these 3 homes that I'm going to show this buyer. And I called the agents, because remember, I can't find it on the MLS anymore. I called the agents and they said, well, hey, we're offering 3%. And then the idea could be that I am trying to steer you to the higher amount. So those are some of the changes that are happening for the buyers. So the buyers are going to have to be more selective who they work with, because under the current system, a buyer, if an agent is willing, a buyer can go and see homes with a couple of different agents. But if every buyer's agent is doing their job and following the rules as of August 17th, that's not going to be the case for the buyer. The buyer will be approached by every buyer's agent that they might work with. And if they want to go see a home, there needs to be an initial agreement.
I have a quick question there. Doesn't that put the wagon before the horse? Because essentially you're agreeing to pay a certain percentage for services that maybe haven't been received yet. And then I don't know, it makes the situation a little bit difficult because now the buyer has to negotiate something that previously was something that was just kind of given that they would be putting down pretty much the 6%, right?
Well, the 6% is this mythical number that the media keeps making up as though, and that's a great question, Jose. Um, that's just, I think that's clickbait, because there's all this stuff that, oh, well, now that this ruling has happened, the automatic 6% will go away. Well, that's never really been the case, and I can honestly say that the commissions have always been negotiable. I usually charge my sellers 2%. When I'm on the buy side, in many cases, depending on who I'm working with, a lot of those buyers might ask me to credit them a certain amount of my commission, which I can do. So my point is that commissions are always negotiable. So that's one thing. To get a little deeper into your question, yeah, that's why buyers agents are going to have to be really skilled at clarifying ahead of time. Here is what I offer. Now, Jose, there's a couple of different options. Buyers agents can just say, I'm gonna, here's a tier, right? So, but once you sign it, that's how it stays. So tier one, I'm going to look on the MLS and I'm going to set up some showings. I'm going to open the door. I might negotiate the contract. That's it. Tier two, there's more services. Tier three, there's more services. So there can be layers to all that. And so, Jose, that could come down to, if you're a first time home buyer and you've never done any of this, you may tell the buyer's agent, I need to go to tier three. And as long as that's agreed upon ahead of time, as long as we're not changing the numbers later, that's fine. Whereas a more experienced buyer might say, I only need tier one. I just need an agent to kind of help me through the basics. And that could be in the form of a percentage of the sale. It could be a flat fee. There's a whole bunch of things that are being worked out. And then the other flexibility to help the buyers, Jose, is the fact that, again, we can start off with, okay, here is my value proposition. Here is a 2-week agreement for us to date each other to decide, okay, Jose can think, oh, is John doing a good job? Is he prompt, and is he finding me the homes that I want to work with? And then from there, we may not have found a home, but then if you're happy with my services, then we could negate the first offer and do a second one, which is more permanent. That's my understanding of how this can work. But you can't, once you sign a contract, you can't change the numbers. So I think what's going to happen is, in the initial kind of dating agreement, you still have to agree to the number, but it can be very temporary. And then if I'm doing a good job and the buyer likes me, then you're locking in the same numbers and the same services, but now you're saying, I am hiring this person as my go-to agent. And so the one thing that's still a little unclear, Jose, is, will you as a buyer be able to have like a few of these dating contracts with different agents? I don't see why you can't. Although if you tell an agent, I'm working with another person, well, then that agent shouldn't be setting up that dating contract with you. But if you're kind of playing the field like a lot of buyers do, where they're like, oh, I think, under this system now, I'll work with this buyer's agent, I'll work with that buyer's agent. They, buyer's agent one might have that temporary agreement, and yet maybe during that same agreement period, another buyer's agent comes along, and you're like, oh, I kind of like him. And then you sign that temporary agreement with him or her, not knowing that you're already under a temporary contract with the other person. That's
Mm-hmm.
where it's really, that's why I think we should do it in part one and part two, because I'm not trying to be vague or confusing, Jose, but we had a podcast with our managing broker today, and they're like, okay, here's where it is now. Here's where it was when the ruling first came out. It'll probably change a fair amount. So we're all just kind of like weaving through all this right now.
What's interesting is I've purchased properties throughout different states. When I was working with the realtor in Hawaii, they made me sign a exclusivity contract to work with them. That meant that I couldn't buy any real estate in all of Hawaii with any other real estate agent. So essentially, I was exclusive with them for a year. Um, yeah, and that was like 2020 actually, when I was buying property over there during the pandemic. So I'm already kind of familiar with something like that. And again, it's kind of an extreme example because honestly, 2 weeks is not bad. I could hold off for 2 weeks. But worst case scenario is, you get somebody, maybe as an experienced investor, maybe you're new to the area, so you're working with a new agent. You sign some sort of, contract, let's say for 2 weeks, but you're experienced to know, wow, okay, this agent really doesn't know what they're doing. I probably need to go with somebody more seasoned. But is that going to keep you from popping over, or is that just going to lock you in to essentially void you some time from being able to look into the market? And I think that's just going to be something that really will have to be vetted out correctly because, time's money. Sometimes the deals are there and then they could be gone in the next day or two, and that's reality. Sometimes you need somebody who can get you the deal, who can negotiate well, or unless you're just gonna try to do those negotiations yourself and you just need, I don't know, almost like the services of a title company. And do you need an agent altogether? I don't know. Kind of asking
Yeah,
myself some of these questions.
for sure. I mean, I think that's why the lawsuit came out the way it did, because in the opinion of many, and I'm just hearsay, I wasn't there, the NAR really didn't do a good job of explaining the value of what the buyer's agent does. Now I do both sides, and I feel like I earn my commission. I think Genevieve would kind of go into that as far as what she's learned, as far as what I do for buyers. And of course, I like working with Genevieve because it's a three-legged stool as far as the lender, the buyer, and the 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 buyer's agent. But yeah, there's so much that goes into it. Again, if you're really experienced, you may not need it. You may be able to go right to the listing agent, which may happen with experienced buyers. They go right to the listing agent, and the listing agent cannot do dual agency in Colorado, but they can, and they probably wouldn't be a transaction broker because they're representing the seller. But I've had this happen before on listings. Buyer comes up, says, "I want to buy it." It's like, fine, I treat you as a customer. I can write up the contract. It's completely up to you that you should be getting following these dates, and that certain dates, and you can't get your earnest money back, and to get an inspection. So I think we'll see more of that from experienced uh, age or buyers. In the old days, they didn't need to worry about it because they weren't paying the commission, or in some cases they were experienced, but they could work with the buyer's agent to actually get some of that commission as a credit back to them as the buyer. But now, if there's no financial incentive for the buyer to do that, they may be doing a lot more. Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Listing Agent, I want to buy the home. Treat me as a client. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I've actually done that as a strategy to be able to stay competitive within kind of getting chosen as the buyer. It was a very well it was a competitive listing. There were a lot of offers coming in over asking, and I decided to come in without an agent because I knew that I'm just kind of speaking from how I felt is as an agent, obviously kind of the responsibility is to the seller if you're representing them. But if you're offering them 6%, let's say that was the magic number, however much they would take both sides, right? They would essentially take the buyer and seller commission. Essentially, that was kind of what I was like offering them without telling them that, but I already knew that. I knew they knew. I already knew they knew, but I'm not sure they knew I knew. But I still represented myself. I told them I was an investor. Proceeded, and they helped me out. They were kind of giving me some hints here and there that were taughting a very specific line where they're still keeping the best interest of the buyer because they're trying to get them a competitive offer, but they're also giving me some help as well, maybe more than they should have. I ended up getting a home, but I think I was able to exploit that in the past, and now I'm kind of curious how it's going to go now that it's become a lot more transparent towards everybody, and things like that are going to be a lot more in the discussions. I think transactions were a lot more straightforward back in the day with like most regular purchases or but now really I think that's going to come in a little bit more into the fold. And honestly, I don't know where I'm going to go because as somebody that has bought real estate in different states, sometimes I feel confident in one specific market, and other markets I'm like, don't know enough about this specific market. I need somebody that is an expert. Otherwise, I'm going to make a mistake. I need somebody to watch my back. So it really kind of depends on my own comfort level, even as someone that has purchased and has gone through the steps of purchasing homes before. I think even I would want certain services. So I like the fact that we were mentioning about tier
Hmm.
um, support and how that could be folded in, because I think that could be a very creative solution towards, people who really need all the help, people who might be mid-level, people who might be a little more better independent. Um, but honestly, I think that change in itself, I just see as an extra cost towards the seller at the end of the day if you're not able to effectively negotiate. So I think I'm seeing a lot more urgency, even myself right now, to like purchase, because I even liquefied um, some of my stocks to be able to get some money for investments. So I'm a lot more liquid now because I'm like, well, I'd rather buy right now and kind of save myself some percentages because I don't want the ruling to come through and I don't want to be dealing with the negotiation. I kind of want it to shake out uh, the next time I buy. I don't want it to be like part of like the guinea pig cohort.
Yeah, I do feel like a lot of I alluded to this earlier. A lot of sellers, I've spoken to a couple now. One, we've already sold the listing. One, we're closing this week. And in both cases, I said, here's the scenario. And not every seller is going to feel this way, but both of them are like, it's a no brainer that we should be offering something because we want a lot of buyers and we want qualified buyers and we want qualified representation. So I think that when a listing agent has a conversation with a seller and kind of says, I can't tell you that you need to have that extra concession, but here are the pros and cons, the way I've laid it out, most people are like, yeah, I think it's important that we have that. And that concession could go to a lot of different things. Like maybe that concession is used. Let's say that they say we're going to offer a $20,000 concession to a buyer's agent, but then they get into a little bit of inspection negotiation, and maybe the buyer's agent says, or excuse me, maybe the seller and the listing agent say, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'll kick in 5,000 as a credit to help deal with these inspection items. But that means that we're only offering 15,000 to the agent, which means the buyer's agent, which means the buyer's agent is going to need to be okay with that. Because remember, the buyer's agent can have an agreement with a buyer that is at a certain height, can't go any higher than that, but that number can always go down. So it's very possible that the seller, the listing agent has the conversation with the seller. What's the total concession you want to offer? And that could be a fixed number. And then some or all of that could go to the buyer's agent. Maybe if everything goes smoothly and there's no problems with the inspection, it looks like all of that's going to go to the buyer's agent. But then there still could be that negotiation like I have with some of my buyers now, where it's like, well, we agreed that you're going to credit me, the buyer, a certain percentage of your buyer's agent commission. So I still think a lot of that is on the table.
Yeah, I think the unusual part is like we typically wouldn't be negotiating on commissions once you're finding things that need to be, let's say, fixed on a home. It just adds an extra layer of complexity, I feel, to be able to close a deal. Honestly, you want to be able to simplify things as much as possible. Like for example, for me, when I know that let's say I know some people that could do it for a very good price, I might not even ask for certain monies just to be able to close out the deal quicker because I'm realizing, well, if I'm just sitting on this money, I'm losing more money just by waiting, prolonging closing. I'm like, I could just take care of it a lot quicker and then it's fine if I eat up some of that cost. But that's part of like the negotiating of like, are you gonna die? Are you gonna really, die on a hill on, like, let's say like a leaky faucet. I'm like, I could have that done within like an hour by somebody I know. So there are some things like you got to pick your fights. If it's something big, then yes, but like small things, I would just I'll just eat them up. But when it comes to concessions on the like, like the percentages, who's going to get how much or some amounts, I feel like that's just going to get more sticky because at least the agents weren't necessarily in the weeds of their money being at stake, if that makes any sense during these negotiations.
And I think the lawsuit at the end of the day is trying to have more transparency so the buyers have negotiating skill over that. And I think maybe a lot of buyer's agent didn't necessarily tell the buyers that, yes, I might be getting 3% from the listing brokerage, but you and I, as buyer and buyer's agent, we can negotiate how much of that commission goes back in your pocket. So as Jen can attest to, there's been many times when we've had a deal about ready to fall through when I've thrown in and said, okay, I'm going to use some of my buyer's commission to get over this hump, because it was the right home. We were within a couple of $1,000s. I was still going to be compensated pretty well. So that's kind of an example of the idea of I start off at a higher point, but I can always go down. So I think in some ways it'll be new, and in some ways it'll be just a different version of the same thing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, it's kind of a piece that I personally still want to continue getting more experience on. Because even though I've gone through negotiating, I got through some contracts, I purchased properties already. I feel like every time you go through it, there's always a nuance on what you're actually negotiating, how you're approaching the purchase. I've never had anything that's been exactly the same. And I think that's always going to be the case going forward. So you always need to understand like your entire tool set. And I think that's going to be the challenge now that things are changing, that does that seller understand the entire tool set? And do I even understand the entire tool set as well?
And the reality is if sellers choose not to, if they choose to say, I am offering zero concession, then it's going to be very similar to homes right now that are on the MLS, which, by the way, can say zero. It used to be that you had to put $1, and then they recently changed it. It can say zero. And then it works really, really well in a hot market. But in a market like this right now, where homes are sitting on the market a little bit longer, at some point, I always tell my buyers, time on the market changes things. Now, that doesn't necessarily. So right now, I usually use that term when we talk about, well, maybe we should go in with a significantly lower offer, because just recently I helped buyers to find something in the Estes Park area, and we offered 45,000 less, and they took it because it had been on the market. So that will still apply always, but then also there's no reason to think that the listing agent and the seller, their original agreement that says no concession, let's say that home is sitting on the market for 100 days, they can still change their contract, because that has nothing to do with the buy side. So the listing agent can go back and say, do you want to do an amendment, and do you now want to offer $10,000 to a buyer's agent? Then that's completely up to them, as long as they amend the original contract. And now the challenge for the listing agent is going to be, how do I get the word out that this home that's been sitting there and wasn't offering any commission, now we're offering a concession, I should say. So that'll be tricky, because you can't put that on the MLS, where right now you could even one week it's 2%. I can always change it and just change it on the MLS.
I have a quick question. As a buyer, are you going to have any visibility on these percentages? Because if you're understanding, like, let's say you're targeting a very specific home, you're like, okay, I'm very interested in this home. I'm going to need the help of a real estate agent, but understanding of what those percentages are going to be up front is going to help you shop around on the buyer representation side. So is that going to be public information?
No. So what listing agents are going to they're going to be inundated. They're going to be inundated with phone calls from other agents who are saying, Joe, my buyer over here is about ready to go see your home. Are you offering a buyer's agent concession? And you, as a buyer who is unrepresented, you have every right to go onto Zillow, because you saw it on Zillow or Redfin. And usually on most of those, you can dig in and you can find the listing agent, and you can call the listing agent just like a buyer's agent could and say, I'm Joe, unrepresented buyer. What are you offering as far as concession? But now in your case, that wouldn't necessarily be as important, right? Because you're not represented.
Mm-hmm.
But you as the
Yeah.
buyer, you as the buyer could, I guess you could use that to say, well, hey, I just want to let you know I'm interested in the home, and I'd like to make a full price offer, and the value that I offer is I don't need any. You don't have to give me the concession. The seller can keep it. Is that kind of where you're going with this?
No, I was just trying to understand if what the seller is going to be putting down as far as you know, a percentage or money, because then either I need to figure out, okay, I'm good with what they're going to provide. I will get representation of like a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or I'll approach it independently and just negotiate on my own. But without having that information of like where they're starting off, um, then I don't know like what type of team to build out to help me get that property. That's what I was saying. Like it feels like we're putting the wagon before the horse. Like if I'm targeting a very specific property, that you know having all these having a seller, sorry, a buyer agent isn't going to help me. Like I essentially have to build it out the other way around, unless I just don't know what I'm doing as far as like a strategy, and I need to just understand all sorts of homes. And honestly, it's going to depend on the market, right? Like, are you going to be competing with tons of people? Then you're going to need somebody that's going to constantly be giving you up and coming homes or coming into the market. Then you're just going to be like bidding and see which ones will take your offer, right? But if it's a very dry market where, if you put in an offer, like it's most likely going to get accepted. So you have more leverage to kind of really pick the home or the property, and then get the buyer agent.
Yeah, because right now a lot of buyers are looking on Zillow and everything, going to open houses and kind of narrowing things down. And then if they get to the point where they want an agent to at least show it to them and build a relationship with an agent, that's when they do it. So yeah, you are right in that. If a buyer thinks they want to use an agent, and if the buyer doesn't want to pay that buyer's agent, then ultimately, when it comes right down to it, they may see 5 homes and they're like, well, I like 3 of these. John, I'm willing to sign a contract, a more extensive contract with you, because if we saw those 5 homes, you already had to do that dating contract. Um, I'd like to sign the more comprehensive one, and I need you to call the agents of those 3, assuming we don't know it yet, and find out of those 3, what are they paying? And if you and I have already got an agreement at 3%, then, remember, I can always go down. I can't go up as far as what I quote unquote charge you. But let's say that 2 of the 3 are offering nothing, and 1 of the 3 is offering 2.5%. Then you as the buyer might make that decision to say, well, I like all 3 of them, but if I go with the one that offers 2.5% from the seller, then nothing comes out of my pocket. And now that's where that becomes the risk for the sellers if they don't offer that concession. But as always, before or after this ruling, it's always been negotiable. But now I think the public is thinking, oh, this is great. No more 6% and no more being forced to do it. And both of those are missed, because it's never been automatic 6% and it's always been negotiable. So I think at first some sellers are going to be like, I'm giving you 2%, Mr. or Mrs. Listing Agent. I'm giving nothing to the buyer's agent. And then it'll really come down to their location and their price point and how many buyers are willing to buy that home if they know there's no way to compensate the buyer's agent. And then the other thing I think is that, and Jen can allude to this a little bit, is right now we're still in flux as far as like private buyers who have money maybe can negotiate through this, and when push comes to shove, they might be able to pay that buyer's agent. But what happens to the first time FHA buyers or the VA buyers who don't have that kind of money? They're already strapped, they're already doing down payment assistance. That could, and Jen, you can speak to this, that could eliminate them, where now that seller that might have had 10 potential buyers, now because you got to weed out the VA and the FHA buyers, now there really are only 4 to 5 that are looking at that home. And that's going to definitely prohibit a bidding war, and may, keep the price of that home lower than what the seller wanted.
Yeah, they have been warning that this could really hurt lower income first time home buyers who don't have all that equity from maybe a previous home sale, with which to negotiate and work with. Um, and yeah, it's very concerning. And I thought a question, um, if, if I want to buy a home and let's say I chose a tier with you or whatever, and I agree that like, yeah, I want to pay you 2.5%, but I don't have the money for that. Is it can I put on you that, yeah, John, you are so worth 2.5%, but I don't have that money. But I want you to now filter and only show me homes that are going to fully pay you 2.5% that I don't have.
Yeah, the only difference is this is my understanding is I can do that because you and I have already got the agreement. Because that's like the two main things of this lawsuit are the buyers and the buyer's agent have to have an agreement before doing any showings, and you have to already agree upon the ceiling of what I can be paid. And then the second thing is it cannot be on the MLS. It cannot be on anything, I believe, that is public facing. That is still so anyway, Jen, in that scenario, what that means is we've identified 5 homes, and I will need to call every listing agent, or if maybe they're allowed to put it on their phone message, maybe they are allowed to put it on a mass email. I don't know yet, but I will have to dig in and find that. And then that will kind of, in a way, that will self-select the properties that fit your particular needs as a buyer, because you want a good buyer's agent and you want to pay, but you can't pay out of pocket. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, because I think I've heard that up until now, was that a rule? I mean, I'm not a realtor, so but I'm like, they were saying you can't steer buyers to ones that have more compensation for a buyer's agent. Did that rule ever exist? But like, that's literally to me what people are going to be asking for when they don't have those kind of funds.
Yeah, it is. It is a little bit bass backwards that way. And yes, as an agent, as a representing you under contract, my job is to find the best home for you, and I am not supposed to like intentionally not show you certain homes because they're only paying 2%. The allegations were that a lot of buyers agents were doing that, and this is one of the many reasons why this lawsuit is happening. But yeah, that is a question and a thing that we're going to run into now. But now it'll be driven more by the buyer and not the buyer's agent. The buyer is basically telling the buyer's agent, you and I are under contract. I'm agreeing to pay you a certain amount. I want you to be compensated. So now I want you to go find the ones that will get your compensation. And most likely, if the buyer's agent is smart, everything should be in email, everything. So that's really clear that you, Jen, told me to go do that.
And John, just a quick comment here. I feel like everything is going to start calibrating itself towards a specific percentage. Like how most homes, there's kind of like a go-to for like a deposit that you're going to give, right? Like when you're putting skin in the game, like I'll put 2,000 down. Usually they'll tell you like, oh, put five. Like there's always kind of like go-to numbers, and
Yeah.
I feel like eventually everyone's gonna figure out like, okay, like me as the if I'm gonna represent you, the seller, uh, you know, we typically have success moving homes at, if we give, I don't know, 2% or whatever, and then on the buyer end, uh, like I feel like there's gonna be agreed upon, like eventually it's gonna calibrate itself to a specific percentage, because that's honestly otherwise a lot of there's going to be a lot of misconnections between buyers and sellers that could have potentially done business, but because they weren't getting their percentages right, uh, they might be missing each other.
And it could be too that you and I agree to 2.5%, and I'm a stickler and I am not going down. I demand 2.5%, and the concession from the seller is 2%. And I ask you to come up with the other 5%. So there's no reason why it can't be a split. But the good news, again, is it can be set higher. And then it could be, as we talk about like how flexible these things could be, it could be, I say, okay, our contract is 2.5%. And somewhere in that contract, it's like, if we cross the threshold and I show you 30 or more, I want the 2.5%, regardless of what we get from the seller side. And you say, okay. And then there could be something in our contract that says, if we run into the scenario, but I'm able to find a home for you and I only showed you 10 or less, then I'm going to be flexible and I'll take, 2%, and I won't charge you the other 0.5. These are all the things that are, that's what the ruling is about. They want as much negotiation as possible. So I do feel at the end of the day, to go back to that question that Jen asked to start, it does affect the buyer and it is going to be confusing. And some buyers are going to be out of luck because they can't afford representation. But for some, like you, Jose, it might work out really well because of the ways that you're going to be able to negotiate exactly what you want from the buyer's agent.
Honestly, that's how I will approach it. Once that change comes, I'm really gonna, filter out, like, we're gonna go with these properties on this percentage or on this base amount. Pretty much don't show me anything else. I'm not sure if a lot of people are going to approach it, but honestly, that might be the most simple way to approach it at first, unless other strategies start coming out, best practices. I think a lot of those are going to eventually happen, but until, people try out different things that are working out effectively, we're just going to have to do kind of like a trial by error.
Yeah. And even in the couple of podcasts I've been listening to, the reality is 1 year from now, we will have a new norm, but it probably still won't be settled. The dust still will not be settled. And there'll probably be some people that will be fined because they intentionally disregarded it. There'll be others that it was an innocent mistake. They didn't know. There's just so much to this. Even the experts, like these managing brokers of these large brokerages like EXP, they're like, we're learning it all. We have our legal team, but there's so much to break down. So there are, and then there's also the question of who is actually going to be policing this. I think what it'll come down to, like, I know in my case, I don't get paid on a transaction until I prove that I have the seller's property disclosure, the lead-based paint, et cetera. And if one of those is missing, then I'm SOL and I've got to figure out a way to get it before I get paid. I can imagine that if an agent like forgets or whatever, neglects to do the right kind of agreement with the buyer, and you get all the way to the closing table, they may say, we're not paying you. And you may not be able to retroactively go back and do that because in this case, it was supposed to be done before you ever started the process. So I see some agents making the mistake or trying to get away with it. And then they'll learn pretty quickly when they get their hand smacked. It's like, oh, I just did all that work and I'm not getting my $10,000. Because that would make total sense. That's a great way to police this whole thing. If you don't have it, and you can prove that it's date stamped before you ever did any of this, then you shouldn't get paid.
Wow. I would not want to be a realtor. I'm so glad you are, John.
Well, I love working with buyers and I'll continue to do that, but this is why I've been focusing on balancing and getting more, listing leads, because I think listing agents are going to be more in the driver's seat. Although there, like I said, there's a lot of extra pressure. The listing agents are now going to have to try to sift through, like, okay, here's the represented buyer, here's the unrepresented buyer. This one doesn't, their agreement doesn't, there's not enough money coming from the seller to pay this particular agent. I don't envy listing agents either. I think it's just for a while there until the dust settles. It'll be really challenging for everyone, and everyone's going to try to do their best, and hopefully, there's going to be some grace as people kind of work through the system.
I feel like where there's a want from both parties, you eventually reach an agreement. Like when everybody's interested in getting that home closed, everybody starts making concessions, because at the end of the day, like if we're all kind of like beating to the same beat, it just naturally happens, right? You're not trying to let things fall apart. Everybody's really taking concessions left and right, if there are some to be made, or hitting the middle ground. But like you mentioned, I think it's going to be a big learning curve of how things are going to be done. And I'm also kind of curious about like the enforcement aspect. Maybe as a somebody who is seeking representation, how about some of these things are not followed? Let's say if I'm a buyer, then like what are my choices, to I don't know, like, do you file a complaint if some of these rights are not now followed? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, at any time you can go to the division, DAR, I forget what it's called, Division of Real Estate, and
Division
DARA.
of Regulatory
Yeah,
Agencies,
yeah, it is. You,
DORA.
every realtor fears that, so you're always trying to avoid that. But yeah, so one of the reasons I've had success is because on the listing side, I just say I'll do 2%, and I'm not greedy. A lot of listing agents are trying to get 2.5, 2.8, 3. I think 2%, especially with these high price points. If I sell a home for $900,000, that's an $18,000 commission. I mean, I feel like I'm good with that. I'm not greedy. And then the other success I've had on the buy side, is I do have a lot of buyers, especially in the Indian community, not trying to target them, but they are shrewd negotiators. And, we'll have that conversation ahead of time. Like, if I work with you, John, because I like you, maybe you're sponsoring my cricket team or whatever. Are you willing to give me a credit of part of your commission that I can use for closing costs? And again, even if I credit them X amount, a percentage, I'm still doing very well. And I still think that that's going to be possible for buyers and buyers agents to have that conversation. If they pick a home and the home is offering 3%, and the agreement between the buyers and the buyer's agent says 3%, well, then we are in complete compliance. And what me and the buyer can do is say, okay, now within that, I'm going to credit the buyer back part of that. Again, the big thing is there's got to be an agreement in place before I start showing it to you. There's the percentage or the flat amount has to be stated ahead of time. It cannot go up, and it's no longer going to be something that me as the buyer's agent can go shopping around on the MLS to find out what that amount is. So Jose, I think we'll do part 2 here. Probably, as you know, August 17th is the drop dead date, so to speak. So I would probably say realistically, Amber and Jen, maybe if we plan on doing this, that whatever that late July one is, a couple of weeks beforehand or early August, I think I'll know a lot more, and we'll just kind of give it a refresh.
We'll pencil you in, John.
Okay.
I'm definitely gonna put you down here for this next one on May 28th, because I mean, this list of questions that we have, I mean, we only got to literally number 1.
Okay.
There's so
So
many.
we'll just do a series of them, and it's good for me too, because I mean, I've been following it since October, but I think because I knew this was coming up, it's like, oh, okay, let's really lock in on what is the latest. But what I'm trying not to do is panic and change everything right now, because it is a moving target. And I think a lot of agents are like reworking everything right now and trying to have all these conversations ahead of time and talking to the buyers about, well, here's what it is now and here's what it's going to be. And I think there's so many things that could change between now and then. And there's still a lot of there's a lot of clear directives from this lawsuit, but there's still quite a few things that are hazy. So for instance, one of the podcasts I listened to is like, what does this mean for virtual showings? And what does this mean for automatic CRMs? Like if I have somebody now in my database, well, right now I can be just sending them things. And maybe that thing has a link to a virtual showing. But then as of April 7th or August 17th, what happens? Like, do I have to completely cut off my CRM? Do I need to take off the virtual showing? I mean, these are all the things that even the quote unquote experts are not sure how to answer yet. And that's where I think there's going to need to be some grace and some, hey, we got into it. I need to slap you on the hand. You can't do that. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know that. That's where I think there'll be a lot of things that will they'll be more clear as we get closer to August 17th, but it'll probably be a few months before we really can zero in on what this all means.
Yeah, and some of these other questions that we didn't even get to tonight, I think are so important. Like it's talking about, they're asking about like the impact to buyers. Is there going to be any silver lining here that maybe there is a positive in this for buyers? Or what is the impact that we're expecting that this is going to have overall on the market? All these other questions we didn't get anywhere close to. So yeah, we are definitely gonna maybe need to have part 2, part 3, you know? And
Well, that'll
especially,
make it easy for you guys.
yeah, I love this idea. We'll just keep making you our presenter. And yeah, and especially too, as things continue to unfold and continue to develop, I think this is gonna fuel a lot of topics for us for a long time, John. So I'm so glad you're as excited about it as I am.
And Jose, I say this sincerely. When we started off, when the three of us brainstormed about doing this, I was always saying, I want this to be as interactive as possible. And some have been more than others, but you adding all the questions and input, I really appreciate that because I just like the format more. When I'm in Zoom calls or live meetings, I don't want to just sit there and listen. I want to be able to chime in. I want to listen and learn. I want to ask questions. So really appreciate your getting involved and participating.
And likewise, I appreciate your explanations because I think you were able to kind of narrow down into some of the nuances of what could potentially be happening and going through scenarios. Because honestly, like you kind of hear theoretically what could happen, and then the big question is like, wait, what does that mean, right? Like, can we talk about like real scenarios of
Yeah.
like what would happen in this situation or in this situation? And I think that makes it a little bit more real, and then you can start thinking about strategies of how to approach the next deal, because I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle, for some of the buyers, especially investors, of like, wait, how do I do this? Like, I have to learn something new, and you don't want to come in with like really no idea of how to approach it. So you kind of want to be able to get educated up front to some degree. So again, I really appreciate you sharing lots of nuggets and sharing your inputs because I think they're super valuable and kind of like that continuous education throughout this entire change that's happening.
Awesome.
There'll be more to come in a couple of weeks.
And Jose, since you're an investor, I don't know what kind of properties you're looking at, but I will share that John and I work with a lot of investors. I mean, from, his clients, like I would say half of them are investors. And I actually have a little niche here when it comes to if an investor is interested in a condo. And as you may have come across, if you've ever tried to purchase those, that can be a little tricky in that investors purchasing condos, if they're getting a mortgage, sometimes it becomes a non-warrantable condo.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually have a workaround for that for some particular common reasons for non-warrantability. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'm able to help my investors a lot of times still be able to get a regular conventional loan as opposed to going with a non-QM, which is going to be a much higher rate, a totally different ball game. So if that's something that you're interested in, please reach out to me. I'd love to educate and help you if that's something that you're interested in, is getting a condo as an investor. And then of course, I would definitely sing John's praises as far as being an amazing realtor to work with. We've been working together now for over 5 years, and he helped me buy my own home, and he's very good at negotiations, saved me tons of money. And we love to have you again because yeah, you have really good insight and experience in your own way that we'd love to have you back in a couple of weeks when we pick this topic back up and go even further.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. I'll try to send you guys emails if you guys have if you guys could share it on the chat. I could follow up by sending a follow up email to each one of you guys. My main focus has been on multifamilies. Pretty much all the properties that I have cash flowed and they're building equity. But again, still continue to invest. Anytime I get a nice chunk of money, I'm looking for the next opportunity. I don't leave money just standing still, whether it's good or bad. But
Yeah.
What is we have a mutual investor, actually all three, because Amber is his insurer. I'm his realtor. Jen's the lender, but we've had some success out in Sterling, Colorado. Found a fourplex out there last year for $425, and when he bought it, it was $850 per unit, $850 rent per month. But he's had some vacancies, and he's been getting $1,100 a month. And it's in Logan County, so the taxes are super low, lower than Weld County, and the price points are significantly low. So there are opportunities in Eastern Colorado. I have my own investments in Greeley, and I've steered a lot of buyers that way. So if I can get your email address, I'd be happy. I won't send you a random nonsensical feed, but I can just pick and choose a few that I think are interesting for you to just look over.
Yeah, I'll put my my email in the chat as well.
Okay.
And then yeah, I'm always looking to get opportunities, whether they're seller finance, or whether they return like a 1% to the total cost. There are certain type of deals like I'll do all day every day. I know that sometimes like sub 2 can be done, but I'm hearing a lot of title companies are starting to shy away from that locally. But yeah, I would love any sort of creative deal. I think that's how you usually make good money anyways. So if there's good opportunities, please let me know.
Oh.
Yep. Fantastic.
Amber actually had to pop off. She had someone at her front door. So she actually had to leave. But yeah, Amber is also an amazing resource as an insurance agent, because she helps also with our investors. She helps them with the the approach of the rental aspect, but also she has access to things like Legal Shield, and other policies that she recommends for her investors, to help protect them from insurance, and how that goes kind of hand in hand with the legal world, and protecting investors. So but yeah, our next meeting is May 28th at 7 p.m. and I'm gonna try to get that posted tomorrow, saying that it's part 2 of where we're leaving off tonight. It is gonna be a different Zoom link every time, so please be sure and do that RSVP on Meetup so you can get access to that new Zoom link. And then we've also got a Facebook group. If you're interested in seeing some of the investment or houses that John likes to post a lot on that group, or articles that we find with regard to real estate, or just being able to easily access us and Facebook message us. That is our Facebook group that we have for this specific group. And then we also have our YouTube channel where things like this, our recording of tonight, as well as past recordings, is going to be up on our YouTube channel, where you can rewatch or share with other people that you think might find it valuable information. So thank you, Jose. You were a wonderful surprise this evening. We really hope to see you again. And John, Sergio, do you have any closing thoughts?
I just better not goof around and call myself an alias next time. I just realized, yeah, that's just there's my name.
You did take a risk, but
Yeah, that's all right.
I was really tame tonight. I didn't make too much fun, so. All righty. Well, you guys have a great evening, and I'm gonna call it an evening and close it out. Thank you so much.
Good night, y'all.
Night.
Night.